Welcome to this compilation of 4 sci-fi short stories about medical marvels. I'll be narrating Man in a Quandary by L.J. Stecher Jr., An Ounce of Cure by Alan E. Nourse, Pandemic by J.F. Bone, and Teething Ring by James Causey. If you didn't know, I've moved the bulk of my narrated stories over to Substack as a result of YouTube's demonetization policy creating uncertainty around this channel. Now on Substack, I publish 3 free stories per week, plus bonus novelette or serialized novel for paid subscribers. You can watch and listen to video, audio, and podcast forms on Substack, and every Saturday I'll send you a helpful roundup of the week's content so you don't miss a thing. Head to storiesfromtheskysff.substack.com, link in the description, to support me over there and help keep this project flourishing. But for now, let's get to the stories. So sit back, relax, and enjoy. Man in a Quandary by L.J. Stecher Jr. Narrated by William Skye. If you were in my, shoes if you don't mind stretching a point, what would you do about this? Dear Miss Dix the Sixth, I have a problem. In spite of rumours to the contrary, my parents were properly married and were perfectly normal people at the time I was born. And so was I. Normal, I mean. But that all contributed to the creation of my problem. I do not know if you can help me resolve it, but you have helped so many others that I am willing to try you. I enjoin you not to answer this letter in your column. Write me privately, please. You know all about me, of course. Who doesn't? But most of what you know about me is bound to be almost entirely wrong, so I will have to clarify my background before I present my problem. Know then that I am Alfred the Magnificent. It surprises you, I imagine, that I would be writing a letter to Miss Dix the Sixth. After all, in spite of the tax rate, I am one of the richest, I will say it, one of the richest men in the world. Every word of that last statement is true. My parents were enormously wealthy, but I have accumulated even more of the world's goods than they ever did. And if they had not been loaded with loot, I would not be here now to be writing this letter to you. Please excuse any lack of smoothness in the style and execution of this letter. I'm doing this all myself. Usually I dictate to a secretary, a live secretary, but you understand that that would not be advisable for a letter of this kind, I'm sure. So, my background. I was born in 2352, and having passed my infantile IQ test with flying colours, was admitted to the Harvard Creche for Superior Children at the usual age of 3 months. The name of Alfred Vanderform naturally had been entered on the rolls much earlier. 10 years earlier, in point of fact. My parents had been fortunate enough to be selected to have 3 children, and I was to be their first. They chose to begin with a son. They had known that they would be chosen, and that I would be a superior child, and had taken the wise precaution of signing me up for Harvard Creche as soon as the planners had finished drawing up their preliminary charts. In spite of what you may have heard, there was absolutely no chance of falsifying the initial IQ examination, in those days at least. I was a physically normal, mentally superior child. My progress at the creche was entirely satisfactory. I was an ordinarily above-average genius in every way. At age 6, I left the creche for my sabbatical year at home with my parents, and it was there that my first disaster occurred. My mother and father moved into the same house while I was there, which was the custom then, and may still be for all I know, in order to provide a proper home-like atmosphere for me. Through some carelessness in original planning, this was also the year that had been selected for the birth of their second child, which was to be a girl. Both parents were to be the same for all 3 of their children. Under usual circumstances, they would have paid enough attention to me so that the disaster would never have been allowed to take place, but plans for their second child must have made them a trifle careless. At any rate, in spite of my early age, an embolism somehow developed, and major damage to my heart resulted. It was here that the great wealth of my parents proved invaluable. Prognosis was entirely unfavourable for me. The routine procedure for a 3-offspring couple would have been to cancel the unsuccessful quota and reissue it for immediate production. However, it was too late to arrange for twins in their second quota, and my parents decided to attempt to salvage me. An artificial heart was prepared and substituted for the original. It had a built-in atomic battery which would require renovation no oftener than every 20 years. Voluntary control was provided through connection with certain muscles in my neck, and I soon learned to operate it at least as efficiently as a normal heart with the normal involuntary controls. The mechanism was considerably bigger than the natural organ, but the salvage operation was a complete success. The bulge between my shoulder blades for the battery and the one in front of my chest for the pump were not excessively unsightly. I entered the Princeton second stage creche for greatly superior children on time, being accepted without objection in spite of my pseudo-deformity. It cannot be proved that any special emolument was offered to or accepted by the creche managers in order to secure my acceptance. My personal belief is that nobody had to cough up. 3 years at Princeton passed relatively uneventfully for me. In spite of the best efforts and assurances of the creche psychologists, there was naturally a certain lack of initial acceptance of me by some of my creche mates. However, they soon became accustomed to my fore and aft bulges, and since I had greater endurance than they, with voluntary control over my artificial heart, I eventually gained acceptance and even a considerable measure of leadership, insofar as leadership by an individual is possible in a creche. Shortly after the beginning of my 4th year at the Princeton creche, the second great personal disaster struck. Somehow or other, the cause has not been determined to this day, my artificial heart went on the blink. I did not quite die immediately, but the prognosis was once again entirely unfavourable. Considerable damage had somehow eventuated to my lungs, my liver, and my kidneys. I was a mess. By this time, my parents had made such a huge investment in me, and my progress reports had been so uniformly excellent, that in spite of all the advice from the doctors, they determined to attempt salvage again. A complete repackaging job was decided upon. Blood was to be received, aerated, purified, and pumped back to the arterial system through a single mechanism which would weigh only about 35 pounds. Of course, this made portability an important factor. Remember that I was only 10 years old. I could probably have carried such a weight around on my back, but I could never have engaged in the proper development of my whole body, and thus could never have been accepted back again by Princeton. It was therefore determined to put the machinery into a sort of cart which I would tow around behind me. Wheels were quickly rejected as being entirely unsatisfactory. They would excessively inhibit jumping, climbing, and many other boyish activities. The manufacturers finally decided to provide the cart with a pair of legs. This necessitated additional machinery and added about 25 pounds to the weight of the finished product. They solved the problem of how I would handle the thing with great ingenuity by making the primary control involuntary. They provided a connection with my spinal cord so that the posterior pair of legs, unless I consciously ordered otherwise, always followed in the footsteps of the anterior pair. If I ran, they ran. If I jumped, they jumped. In order to make the connection to my body, the manufacturers removed my coccyx and plugged in at and around the end of my spinal column. In other words, I had a very long and rather flexible tail, at the end of which was a smoothly streamlined flesh-coloured box that followed me around on its own 2 legs. A human has certain normally atrophied muscles for control of his usually non-existent tail. Through surgery and training, those muscles became my voluntary controllers for my tail and the cart. That is, I could go around wagging my tail while dragging my wagon. Pardon me, Miss Dix the Sixth. That just slipped out. Well, the thing actually worked. You should have seen me in a high hurdle race. Me running along and jumping over the hurdles, with that contraption galloping along right behind me, clearing every hurdle I cleared. I kept enough slack in my tail so I wouldn't get pulled up short, and then just forgot about it. Going off a diving board was a little bit different. I learned to do things like that with my back legs under voluntary control. Speaking of diving boards, maybe you wonder how I could swim while towing a trailer. No trouble at all. I would just put my tail between my legs and have my cart grab me around the waist with a kind of body scissors. The cart's flexible air sac was on its top when it was in normal position, so this held it away from my body where it would not get squeezed. I would take in just enough air so that it was neutrally buoyant, and with its streamlined shape, it didn't slow me down enough to notice. I usually breathed, or took in my air, through the intakes of the cart, and they stayed underwater, but there was an air connection through my tail up to the lung cavity anyway, allowing me to talk. So I just breathed through my mouth in the old-fashioned way. Backing up was rather a problem, with my posterior legs leading the way, and dancing was nearly impossible until I got the idea of having my trailer climb up and out of the way onto my shoulders while I danced. That got me by Princeton's requirements, but I must confess that I was never very much in demand as a dancing partner. At any rate, that system got me through to my 6th and last year at Princeton. I sometimes believe that I may be considered to be what is occasionally called an accident-prone. I seem to have had more than my share of tough luck. During my last year at Princeton, I got my throat cut. It was an accident, of course. No Princeton man would ever dream of doing away with someone he had taken a dislike to quite so crudely, or messily. By voluntary control of my heart, I slowed the action down to the point where I managed to keep from bleeding to death, but my larynx was destroyed beyond repair. That was when I got my Voda installation. It fitted neatly where my lungs used to be, and because it used the same resonant cavities, I soon learned to imitate my own voice well enough so that nobody could tell the difference, before or after. Actually, it was a minor accident, but I thought I'd mention it because of what the news media sometimes call my inhuman voice. It even enables me to sing, something I never was much good at before that accident. Also, I could imitate a banjo and sing at the same time, a talent that made me popular at picnics. That was the last real accident I had for quite a while. I got through my second and last home sabbatical, my upper school, my first college, and my second college. I was chosen for and got through advanced college with highest honours. Counting sabbaticals, that took a total of 29 years, plus the last of my time at Princeton. And then, an eager youth of 42, I was on my own, ready to make my way in the world. I was smart enough to avoid the government service that catches so many of us so-called super geniuses. It's very satisfying work and all that, I suppose, but there's no money in it, and I was rich enough to want to get richer. The cart containing my organs didn't get in my way too much. With my athletic days behind me, I taught it to come to heel instead of striding along behind me. It was less efficient, but it was a lot less conspicuous. I had a second involuntary control system built in so it would stay at heel without conscious thought on my part once I put it there. In my office, I would have it curl up at my feet like a sleeping dog. People told me it was hardly noticeable, even people who didn't work for me. It certainly didn't bother me or hold me back. I started to make money as though I had my own printing press and managed to hang on to most of it. In spite of what the doom criers say, as long as there is an element of freedom in this country, and I think there always will be, there will be ways, and I mean legal ways, of coming into large hunks of cash. Within 10 years, I was not only big rich, I was one of the most important people in the world. A policymaker. A power. It was about that time that I drank the bottle of acid. Nobody was trying to poison me. I wasn't trying to kill myself either. Not even subconsciously. I was just thirsty. All I can say is I did a first-rate job with what was left of my insides. Well, they salvaged me again, and what I ended up with was a pair of carts, one trotting along beside each heel. The leash for the second one was plugged into me in front instead of in the back, naturally, but with my clothes on nobody could tell, just by looking, that they were attached to me at all. The doctors offered to get me by without the second trailer. They figured they could prepare pre-digested food and introduce it into my bloodstream through the mechanism of my original wagon. I refused to let them. I had gotten too used to eating. So whatever I ate was ground up and pumped into my new trailer, or should it be procedure. There it would be processed and the nutriments passed into my bloodstream as required. I couldn't overeat if I tried. It was all automatic, not even hooked into my nervous system. Unusable products were compressed and neatly packaged for disposal at any convenient time. In cellophane. There was, of course, interconnection inside of me between the two carts. I'm told I started quite a fad for walking dogs in pairs. It didn't affect me at all. I never got very good at voluntary control of my second trailer, but by that time my habit patterns were such that I hardly noticed it. Oh yes, about swimming. I still enjoyed swimming and worked it out this way. Wagon number 2 replaced number 1 in straddling me, and wagon number 1 hung on to number 2. It slowed me down, but it still let me swim. I quit diving. I couldn't spare the time to figure out how to manage it. That took care of the next 5 years. I kept on getting richer. I was a happy man. Then came the crowning blow. What was left of me developed cancer. It attacked my brain, among other things, and it was inoperable. It looked as if I had only a couple of years before deterioration of my mental powers set in, and then it would be the scrap heap for me. But I didn't give up. By that time I had gotten used to the parts replacement program, and I was very rich, so I told them to get busy and build me an artificial brain as good as my own. They didn't have time to make a neat package job this time. They took over 3 big buildings in the center of town and filled them with electronics. You should see the cable conduits connecting those buildings together. Then they bought the Broadway power plant and used most of its output. They ran in new water mains to provide the coolant. They used most of my money, and it took all of my influence to speed things up, but they got the job done in time. It won't do you any good to ask me how they transferred my memories and my personality to that mass of tubes and wires and tapes and transistors. I don't know. They tell me that it was the easiest part of the job, and I know that they did it perfectly. My brain power and my personality came through unchanged. I used them to get rich again in mighty short order. I had to pay my water and power bills. I came out of it Alfred the Magnificent, and still I'm just as human as you are, even if a lot of people, a few billions of them I guess, won't believe it. Granted, there isn't much of the original me left, but there's an old saying that glands make the man. Underneath it all, I'm the same Alfred Vanderform, the same old ordinary super genius that I have always been. I have almost finished with the background material, Miss Dix the Sixth, and am nearly ready to present you my problem. I am now approaching the age of 60, and have therefore reached the time of selection for fatherhood. I have, in fact, been fortunate enough to be one of the few selected to father 3 children. If you have chanced to hear rumours that money changed hands in getting me selected, let me tell you that they are entirely true. The only thing wrong about the rumours is that none of them has named a big enough amount, not nearly big enough. It isn't that I don't qualify by any honest evaluation. I do. But there has been a good deal of prejudice against me as a father, and even some scepticism about my capability. But that doesn't matter. What does is that I have been selected. What is more, a single superior female was chosen to be mother of all 3 of my children. By what is not at all a coincidence, this woman happens to be my private secretary. She is, I may add, very beautiful. I am just old-fashioned enough to want my children to have all of the advantages that I had myself, including parents who are fully married, in the same way that my own mother and father were. Legal ceremony, religious service, everything. So, I have asked the chosen mother of my children to marry me, and Gloria, that's her name, has been gracious enough to accept. We are to be married week after next. Now, Miss Dix the Sixth, we come to my problem. How can I tell if Gloria is in love with me or is just marrying me for my money? Perplexed, Alfred Vanderform, the Magnificent. An Ounce of Cure by Alan E. Nourse. Narrated by William Skye. The doctor's office was shiny and modern. Behind the desk, the doctor smiled down at James Wheatley through thick glasses. "Now then, what seems to be the trouble?" Wheatley had been palpitating for 5 days straight at the prospect of coming here. "I know it's silly," he said, "but I've been having a pain in my toe." "Indeed," said the doctor. "Well now, how long have you had this pain, my man?" "About 6 months now, I'd say. Just now and then, you know. It's never really been bad. Until last week. You see—" "I see," said the doctor. "Getting worse all the time, you say?" Wheatley wiggled the painful toe reflectively. "Well, you might say that. You see, when I first—" "How old did you say you were, Mr. Wheatley?" 55. 55? The doctor leafed through the medical record on his desk. "But this is incredible! You haven't had a check-up in almost 10 years!" "I guess I haven't," said Wheatley apologetically. "I'd been feeling pretty well until—" "Feeling well?" The doctor stared in horror. "But my dear fellow, no check-up since January 1963. We aren't in the Middle Ages, you know. This is 1972. "Well, of course you may be feeling well enough, but that doesn't mean everything is just the way it should be. And now, you see, you're having pains in your toes." "One toe," said Wheatley, "the little one on the right. It seemed to me—" "One toe today, perhaps," said the doctor heavily, "but tomorrow—" He heaved a sigh. "How about your breathing lately? Been growing short of breath when you hurry upstairs?" "Well, I have been bothered a little." "I thought so. Heart pound when you run for the subway? Feel tired all day? Pains in your calves when you walk fast?" Yes, occasionally. Wheatley looked worried and rubbed his toe on the chair leg. "You know that 55 is a dangerous age," said the doctor gravely. "Do you have a cough? Heartburn after dinner? Prop up on pillows at night?" "Just as I thought. And no check-up for 10 years. He sighed again. "I suppose I should have seen to it," Wheatley admitted. "But you see, it's just that my toe—" "My dear fellow, your toe is part of you. It doesn't just exist down there all by itself. If your toe hurts, there must be a reason." Wheatley looked more worried than ever. "There must? I thought perhaps you could just give me a little something—" "To stop the pain?" The doctor looked shocked. "Well, of course I could do that, but that's not getting at the root of the trouble, is it? That's just treating symptoms. Medieval quackery. Medicine has advanced a long way since your last checkup, my friend, and even treatment has its dangers. Did you know that more people died last year of aspirin poisoning than of cyanide poisoning?" Wheatley wiped his forehead. Dear me, I never realized. "We have to think about those things," said the doctor. "Now, the problem here is to find out why you have the pain in your toe. It could be inflammatory, maybe a tumor. Perhaps it could be, functional, or maybe vascular." "Perhaps you could take my blood pressure or something," Wheatley offered. "Well, of course I could, but that isn't really my field, you know. It wouldn't really mean anything if I did it. But there's nothing to worry about. We have a fine hypertensive man at the diagnostic clinic." The doctor checked the appointment book on his desk. "Now, if we could see you there next Monday morning at 9... "Very interesting x-rays," said the young doctor with the red hair. "Very interesting. See this shadow in the duodenal cap? See the prolonged emptying time? And I've never seen such beautiful pylorospasm." "This is my toe?" asked Wheatley, edging toward the doctor's. It seemed he had been waiting for a very long time. "Toe? Oh, no," said the red-headed doctor. "No, that's the orthopedic radiologist's job. I'm a gastrointestinal man myself. Upper. Dr. Schultz here is lower." The red-headed doctor turned back to his consultation with Dr. Schultz. Mr. Wheatley rubbed his toe and waited. Presently, another doctor came by. He looked very grave as he sat down beside Wheatley. "Tell me, Mr. Wheatley, have you had an orthodiagram recently?" "No." "An EKG?" "No." "Fluoroaortogram?" "I don't think so." The doctor looked even graver and walked away, muttering to himself. In a few moments he came back with 2 more doctors. "No question in my mind that it's cardiomegaly," he was saying, "but Haddonfield should know. He's the best left ventricle man in the city. Excellent paper in the AMA Journal last July, The Inadequacies of Modern Orthodiagrammatic Techniques in Demonstrating Minimal Left Ventricular Hypertrophy. A brilliant study, simply brilliant. Now this patient..." He glanced toward Wheatley, and his voice dropped to a mumble. Presently 2 of the men nodded, and one walked over to Wheatley, cautiously, as though afraid he might suddenly vanish. "Now, there's nothing to be worried about, Mr. Wheatley," he said. "We're going to have you fixed up in just no time at all. Just a few more studies. Now, if you could see me in Valve Clinic tomorrow afternoon at 3... Wheatley nodded. "Nothing serious, I hope?" "Serious? Oh, no. Dear me, you mustn't worry. Everything is going to be all right," the doctor said. "Well, that is, my toe is still bothering me some. It's not nearly as bad, but I wondered if maybe you..." Dawn broke on the doctor's face. "Give you something for it? Well now, we aren't therapeutic, man, you understand. Always best to let the expert handle the problem in his own field." He paused, stroking his chin for a moment. "Tell you what we'll do. Dr. Epstein is one of the finest therapeutic men in the city. He could take care of you in a jiffy. We'll see if we can't arrange an appointment with him after you've seen me tomorrow." Mr. Wheatley was late to mitral valve clinic the next day because he had gone to aortic valve clinic by mistake, but finally he found the right waiting room. A few hours later he was being thumped, photographed, and listened to. Substances were popped into his right arm and withdrawn from his left arm as he marveled at the brilliance of modern medical techniques. Before they were finished, he had been seen by both the mitral man and the aortic men, as well as the great arteries man and the peripheral capillary bed man. The therapeutic man happened to be in Atlantic City at a convention, and the rheumatologist was on vacation, so Wheatley was sent to functional clinic instead. "Always have to rule out these things," the doctors agreed. "Wouldn't do much good to give you medicine if your trouble isn't organic now, would it?" The psychoneuroticist studied his sex life, while the psychosociologist examined his social milieu. Then they conferred for a long time. 3 days later, he was waiting in the hallway downstairs again. Heads met in a huddle, words and phrases slipped out from time to time as the discussion grew heated. "No doubt in my mind that it's a... But we can't ignore the endocrine implications, Doctor." "You're perfectly right there, of course. Bittenbender at the university might be able to answer the question. No better pituitary osmoreceptorologist in the city." "A tubular function man should look at those kidneys first. He's 55, you know." "Has anyone studied his filtration fraction?" "Might be a peripheral vascular spasticity factor." After a while, James Wheatley rose from the bench and slipped out the door, limping slightly as he went. The room was small and dusky, with heavy Turkish drapes obscuring the dark hallway beyond. A suggestion of incense hung in the air. In due course, a gaunt, swarthy man in moustache and turban appeared through the curtains and bowed solemnly. "You come with a problem?" he asked in a slight accent. "As a matter of fact, yes," James Wheatley said hesitantly. "You see, I've been having a pain in my right little toe." If you're enjoying the stories, hit the like button. It spreads this video to others and helps the channel grow. Thanks. Pandemic by J.F. Bone. Narrated by William Skye. Generally, human beings don't do totally useless things consistently and widely, so maybe there is something to it. We call it Thurston's disease for two perfectly good reasons, Dr. Walter Kramer said. He discovered it, and he was the first to die of it. The doctor fumbled fruitlessly through the pockets of his lab coat. Now, where the devil did I put those matches? Are these what you're looking for? The trim blonde in the grey seersucker uniform asked. She picked a small box of wooden safety matches from the littered lab table beside her and handed them to him. Ah, Kramer said. Thanks. Things have a habit of getting lost around here. I can believe that, she said as she eyed the frenzied disorder around her. Her boss wasn't much better than his laboratory, she decided as she watched him strike a match against the side of the box and apply the flame to the charred bowl of his pipe. His long, dark face became half obscured behind a cloud of bluish smoke as he puffed furiously. He looked like a lean, untidy devil recently escaped from hell, with his thick brows, green eyes, and lank black hair highlighted intermittently by the leaping flame of the match. He certainly didn't look like a pathologist. She wondered if she was going to like working with him, and shook her head imperceptibly. Possibly, but not probably. It might be difficult being cooped up here with him day after day. Well, she could always quit if things got too tough. At least there was that consolation. He draped his lean body across a lab stool and leaned his elbows on its back. There was a faint smile on his face as he eyed her quizzically. You're new, he said. Not just to this lab, but to the Institute. She nodded. I am, but how did you know? Thurston's disease. Everyone in the Institute knows that name for the plague, but few outsiders do. He smiled sardonically. Virus pneumonic plague. That's a better term for public use. After all, what good does it do to advertise a doctor's stupidity? She eyed him curiously. De mortuis? She asked. He nodded. That's about it. We may condemn our own, but we don't like laymen doing it. And besides, Thurston had good intentions. He never dreamed this would happen. The road to hell, so I hear, is paved with good intentions. Undoubtedly, Kramer said dryly. Incidentally, did you apply for this job, or were you assigned? I applied. Someone should have warned you I dislike clichés, he said. He paused a moment and eyed her curiously. Just why did you apply? He asked. Why are you imprisoning yourself in a sealed laboratory which you won't leave as long as you work here? You know, of course, what the conditions are. Unless you resign or are carried out feet first, you will remain here. Have you considered what such an imprisonment means? I considered it, she said, and it doesn't make any difference. I have no ties outside, and I thought I could help. I've had training. I was a nurse before I was married. Divorced? Widowed. Kramer nodded. There were plenty of widows and widowers outside. Too many. But it wasn't much worse than in the Institute where, despite precautions, Thurston's disease took its toll of life. Did they tell you this place is called the suicide section? He asked. She nodded. Weren't you frightened? Of dying? Hardly. Too many people are doing it nowadays. He grimaced, looking more satanic than ever. You have a point, he admitted, but it isn't a good one. Young people should be afraid of dying. You're not? I'm not young. I'm 35, and besides, this is my business. I've been looking at death for 11 years. I'm immune. I haven't your experience, she admitted, but I have your attitude. What's your name? Kramer said. Barton, Mary Barton. Well, Mary, I can't turn you down. I need you. But I could wish you had taken some other job. I'll survive. He looked at her with faint admiration in his greenish eyes. Perhaps you will, he said. All right. As to your duties, you will be my assistant, which means you'll be a dishwasher, laboratory technician, secretary, junior pathologist, and coffee maker. I'll help you with all the jobs except the last one. I make lousy coffee." Kramer grinned, his teeth a white flash across the darkness of his face. "You'll be on call 24 hours a day, underpaid, overworked, and in constant danger until we lick Thurston's virus. You'll be expected to handle the jobs of 3 people, unless I can get more help, and I doubt that I can. People stay away from here in droves. There's no future in it." Mary smiled wryly. "Literally or figuratively?" she asked. He chuckled. "You have a nice sense of graveyard humor," he said. "It'll help. But don't get careless. Assistants are hard to find." She shook her head. "I won't. While I'm not afraid of dying, I don't want to do it. And I have no illusions about the danger. I was briefed quite thoroughly." "They wanted you to work upstairs?" She nodded. "I suppose they need help too. Thurston's disease has riddled the medical profession. Just don't forget that this place can be a death trap. One mistake and you've had it. Naturally, we take every precaution, but with a virus, no protection is absolute. If you're careless and make errors in procedure, sooner or later one of those submicroscopic protein molecules will get into your system." "You're still alive." "So I am," Kramer said, "but I don't take chances. My predecessor, my secretary, my lab technician, my junior pathologist, and my dishwasher all died of Thurston's disease." He eyed her grimly. "Still want the job?" he asked. "I lost a husband and a 3-year-old son," Mary said with equal grimness. "That's why I'm here. I want to destroy the thing that killed my family. I want to do something. I want to be useful." He nodded. "I think you can be," he said quietly. "Mind if I smoke?" she asked. "I need some defense against that pipe of yours." "No, go ahead. Out here it's all right, but not in the security section." Mary took a package of cigarettes from her pocket, lit one, and blew a cloud of grey smoke to mingle with the blue haze from Kramer's pipe. "Comfortable?" Kramer asked. She nodded. He looked at his wristwatch. "We have half an hour before the roll tube cultures are ready for examination. That should be enough to tell you about the modern Pasteur and his mutant virus. Since your duties will primarily involve Thurston's disease, you better know something about it." He settled himself more comfortably across the lab bench and went on talking in a dry schoolmaster-ish voice. "Alan Thurston was an immunologist at Midwestern University Medical School. Like most men in the teaching trade, he also had a research project. If it worked out, he'd be one of the great names in medicine, like Jenner, Pasteur, and Salk. The result was that he pushed it, and wasn't too careful. He wanted to be famous." "He's well known now," Mary said, "at least within the profession." "Quite," Kramer said dryly. "He was working with gamma radiations on microorganisms, trying to produce a mutated strain of Micrococcus pyogenes that would have enhanced antigenic properties." "Wait a minute, Doctor. It's been 4 years since I was active in nursing. Translation, please?" Kramer chuckled. "He was trying to make a vaccine out of a common infectious organism. You may know it better as Staphylococcus. As you know, it's a pus former that's made hospital life more dangerous than it should be because it develops resistance to antibiotics. What Thurston wanted to do was to produce a strain that would stimulate resistance in the patient without causing disease, something that would help patients protect themselves rather than rely upon doubtfully effective antibiotics. That wasn't a bad idea. There was nothing wrong with it. The only trouble was that he wound up with something else entirely. He was like the man who wanted to make a plastic suitable for children's toys and ended up with a new explosive. You see, what Thurston didn't realize was that his cultures were contaminated. He'd secured them from the university clinic and had, so he thought, isolated them. But somehow he'd brought a virus along, probably one of the orphan group, or possibly a phage. Orphan? Yes, one that was not a normal inhabitant of human tissues. At any rate, there was a virus, and he mutated it rather than the bacteria. Actually, it was simple enough, relatively speaking. since a virus is infinitely simpler in structure than a bacterium, and hence much easier to modify with ionizing radiation. So he didn't produce an antigen, he produced a disease instead. Naturally, he contracted it, and during the period between his infection and death, he managed to infect the entire hospital. Before anyone realized what they were dealing with, the disease jumped from the hospital to the college, and from the college to the city, and from the city to... Yes, I know that part of it. It's all over the world now, killing people by the millions. Well, Kramer said, at least it solved the population explosion. He blew a cloud of blue smoke in Mary's direction. And it did make Thurston famous. His name won't be quickly forgotten. She coughed. I doubt if it ever will be, she said, but it won't be remembered the way he intended. He looked at her suspiciously. That cough. No, it's not Thurston's disease. It's that pipe. It's rancid. It helps me think, Kramer said. You could try cigarettes, or candy, she suggested. I'd rather smoke a pipe. There's cancer of the lip and tongue, she said helpfully. Don't quote Oxner. I don't agree with him. And besides, you smoke cigarettes, which are infinitely worse. Only 4 or 5 a day. I don't saturate my system with nicotine. In another generation, Kramer observed, you'd have run through the streets of the city brandishing an axe, smashing saloons. You're a lineal descendant of Carrie Nation. He puffed quietly until his head was surrounded by a nimbus of smoke. Stop trying to reform me, he added. You haven't been here long enough. Not even God could do that, according to the reports I've heard, she said. He laughed. I suppose my reputation gets around. It does. You're an opinionated slave driver, a bully, an intellectual tyrant, and the best pathologist in this centre. The last part of that sentence makes up for unflattering honesty of the first, Kramer said. At any rate, once we realized the situation, we went to work to correct it. Institutes like this were established everywhere the disease appeared for the sole purpose of examining, treating, and experimenting with the hope of finding a cure. This section exists for the evaluation of treatment. We check the human cases and the primates in the experimental laboratories. It is our duty to find out if anything the boys upstairs try shows any promise. We were a pretty big section once, but Thurston's virus has whittled us down. Right now there is just you and me. But there's still enough work to keep us busy. The experiments are still going on, and there are still human cases, even though the virus has killed off most of the susceptibles. We've evaluated over 1,000 different drugs and treatments in this institute alone. And none of them have worked? No, but that doesn't mean the work's been useless. The research has saved others thousands of man-hours chasing false leads. In this business, negative results are almost as important as positive ones. We may never discover the solution, but our work will keep others from making the same mistakes. I never thought of it that way. People seldom do. But if you realize that this is international, that every worker on Thurston's disease has a niche to fill, the picture will be clearer. We're doing our part inside the plan. Others are too. And there are thousands of labs involved. Somewhere someone will find the answer. It probably won't be us, but we'll help get the problem solved as quickly as possible. That's the important thing. It's the biggest challenge the race has ever faced, and the most important. It's a question of survival. Kramer's voice was sober. We have to solve this. If Thurston's disease isn't checked, the human race will become extinct. As a result, for the first time in history, all mankind is working together. All? You mean the communists are too? Of course. What's an ideology if there are no people to follow it? Kramer knocked the ashes out of his pipe, looked at the laboratory clock, and shrugged. 10 minutes more, he said, and these tubes will be ready. Keep an eye on that clock and let me know. Meantime, you can straighten up this lab and find out where things are. I'll be in the office checking the progress reports. He turned abruptly away, leaving her standing in the middle of the cluttered laboratory. Now, what am I supposed to do here? Mary wondered aloud. Clean up, he says. Find out where things are, he says. Get acquainted with the place, he says. I could spend a month doing that. She looked at the littered bench, the wall cabinets with sliding doors half open, the jars of reagents sitting on the sink, the drain board, on top of the refrigerator, and on the floor. The disorder was appalling. How he ever manages to work in here is beyond me. I suppose that I'd better start somewhere. Perhaps I can get these bottles in some sort of order first. She sighed and moved toward the wall cabinets. Oh well, she mused. I asked for this. Didn't you hear that buzzer? Kramer asked. Was that for me? Mary said, looking up from a pile of bottles and glassware she was sorting. Partly. It means they've sent us another post-mortem from upstairs. What is it? I don't know. Man or monkey, it makes no difference. Whatever it is, it's Thurston's disease. Come along. You might as well see what goes in our ultra-modern necropsy suite. I'd like to. She put down the bottle she was holding and followed him to a green door at the rear of the laboratory. Inside, Kramer said, you will find a small anteroom, a shower, and a dressing room. Strip, shower, and put on a clean set of lab coveralls and slippers which you will find in the dressing room. You will find surgical masks in the wall cabinet beside the lockers. Go through the door beyond the dressing room and wait for me there. I'll give you 10 minutes. We do this both ways, Kramer said as he joined her in the narrow hall beyond the dressing room. We'll reverse the process going out. You certainly carry security to a maximum, she said through the mask that covered the lower part of her face. You haven't seen anything yet, he said as he opened a door in the hall. Note the positive air pressure, he said. Theoretically, nothing can get in here except what we bring with us, and we try not to bring anything. He stood aside to show her the glassed-in cubicle overhanging a bare room dominated by a polished steel post-mortem table that glittered in the harsh fluorescent lighting. Above the table, a number of jointed rods and clamps hung from the ceiling. A low metal door and series of racks containing instruments and glassware were set into the opposite wall together with the gaping circular orifice of an open autoclave. We work by remote control, just like they do at the AEC. See those handlers? He pointed to the control console set into a small stainless steel table standing beside the sheet of glass at the far end of the cubicle. They're connected to those gadgets up there. He indicated the jointed arms hanging over the autopsy table in the room beyond. I could perform a major operation from here and never touch the patient. Using these, I can do anything I could in person, with the difference that there's a 1/4 inch of glass between me and my work. I have controls that let me use magnifiers and even do microdissection if necessary. Where's the cadaver? Mary asked. Across the room behind that door, he said, waving at the low sliding metal partition behind the table. It's been prepped, decontaminated, and ready to go. What happens when you're through? Watch. Dr. Kramer pressed a button on the console in front of him. A section of flooring slid aside, and the table tipped. The cadaver slides off that table and through that hole. Down below is a highly efficient crematorium. Mary shivered. Neat and effective, she said shakily. After that, the whole room is sprayed with germicide and sterilized with live steam. The instruments go into the autoclave, and 30 minutes later, we're ready for another post-mortem. We use the handlers to put specimens into those jars, he said, pointing to a row of capped glass jars of assorted sizes on a wall rack behind the table. After they're capped, the jars go onto that carrier beside the table. From here, they pass through a decontamination chamber and into the remote control laboratory across the hall, where we can run biochemical and histological techniques. Finished slides and mounted specimens then go through another decontamination process to the outside lab. Theoretically, this place is proof against anything. It seems to be, Mary said, obviously impressed. I've never seen anything so elegant. Neither did I until Thurston's disease became a problem. Kramer shrugged and sat down behind the controls. Watch now, he said as he pressed a button. Let's see what's on deck. Man or monkey? Want to make a bet? I'll give you 2-1 it's a monkey. She shook her head. The low door slid aside, and a steel carriage emerged into the necropsy room, bearing the nude body of a man. The corpse gleamed pallidly under the harsh, shadowless glare of the fluorescence in the ceiling as Kramer, using the handlers, rolled it onto the post-mortem table and clamped it in place on its back. He pushed another button, and the carriage moved back into the wall, and the steel door slid shut. "That'll be decontaminated," he said, "and sent back upstairs for another body." "I'd have lost," he remarked idly. "Lately the posts have been running 3-1 in favour of monkeys." He moved a handler and picked up a heavy scalpel from the instrument rack. "There's a certain advantage to this," he said as he moved the handler delicately. "These gadgets give a tremendous mechanical advantage. I can cut right through small bones and cartilage without using a saw." "How nice," Mary said. "I expect you enjoy yourself." "I couldn't ask for better equipment," he replied non-committally. With deft motion of the handler, he drew the scalpel down across the chest and along the costal margins in the classic inverted Y incision. "We'll take a look at the thorax first," he said as he used the handlers to pry open the rib cage and expose the thoracic viscera. "Ah, thought so. See that?" He pointed with a small handler that carried a probe. "Look at those lungs." He swung a viewer into place so Mary could see better. "Look at those abscesses and necrosis. It's Thurston's disease, all right, with secondary bacterial invasion." The greyish, solidified masses of tissue looked nothing like the normal pink appearance of healthy lungs. Studded with yellowish spherical abscesses, they lay swollen and engorged within the gaping cavity of the chest. "You know the pathogenesis of Thurston's disease?" Kramer asked. Mary shook her head, her face yellowish-white in the glare of the fluorescence. "It begins with a bronchial cough," Kramer said. "The virus attacks the bronchioles first, destroys them, and passes into the deeper tissues of the lungs. As with most virus diseases, there is a transitory leukopenia, a drop in the total number of white blood cells, and a rise in temperature of about 2 or 3 degrees. As the virus attacks the alveolar structures, the temperature rises and the white blood cell count becomes elevated. The lungs become inflamed and painful. There is a considerable quantity of lymphoid exudate and pleural effusion. Secondary invaders and pus-forming bacteria follow the viral destruction of the lung tissue and form abscesses. Breathing becomes progressively more difficult as more lung tissue is destroyed. Hepatization and necrosis inactivate more lung tissue as the bacteria get in their dirty work, and finally, the patient suffocates." "But what if the bacteria are controlled by antibiotics?" "Then the virus does the job. It produces atelectasis followed by progressive necrosis of lung tissue with gradual liquefaction of the parenchyma. It's slower, but just as fatal. This fellow was lucky. He apparently stayed out of here until he was almost dead. Probably he's had the disease for about a week. If he'd have come in early, we could have kept him alive for maybe a month. The end, however, would have been the same." "It's a terrible thing," Mary said faintly. "You'll get used to it. We get 1 or 2 every day." He shrugged. "There's nothing here that's interesting," he said as he released the clamps and tilted the table. For what seemed to Mary an interminable time, the cadaver clung to the polished steel. Then, abruptly, it slid off the shining surface and disappeared through the square hole in the floor. "We'll clean up now," Kramer said, as he placed the instruments in the autoclave, closed the door and locked it, and pressed 3 buttons on the console. From jets embedded in the walls, a fine spray filled the room with fog. "Germicide," Kramer said. "Later there'll be steam. That's all for now. Do you want to go?" Mary nodded. "If you feel a little rocky, there's a bottle of scotch in my desk. I'll split a drink with you when we get out of here." "Thanks," Mary said. "I think I could use one." "Barton, where is the McNeil stain?" Kramer's voice came from the lab. "I left it on the sink and it's gone." "It's with the other blood stains and reagents. Second drawer from the right in the big cabinet. There's a label on the drawer," Mary called from the office. "If you can wait until I finish filing these papers, I'll come in and help you." "I wish you would." Kramer's voice was faintly exasperated. "Ever since you've organized my lab, I can't find anything." "You just have a disorderly mind," Mary said as she slipped the last paper into its proper folder and closed the file. I'll be with you in a minute." "I don't dare lose you," Kramer said as Mary came into the lab. "You've made yourself indispensable. It'd take me 6 months to undo what you've done in 1. Not that I mind," he amended, "but I was used to things the way they were." He looked around the orderly laboratory with a mixture of pride and annoyance. "Things are so neat they're almost painful." "You look more like a pathologist should," Mary said as she deftly removed the tray of blood slides from in front of him and began to run the stains. "It's my job to keep you free to think." "Whose brilliant idea is that? Yours?" "No, the director's. He told me what my duties were when I came here, and I think he's right. You should be using your brain rather than fooling around with bloodstains and sectioning tissues." "But I like to do things like that," Kramer protested. "It's relaxing." "What right have you to relax?" Mary said. "Outside, people are dying by the thousands, and you want to relax. Have you looked at the latest mortality reports?" "No." "You should. The WHO estimates that nearly 2 billion people have died since Thurston's disease first appeared in epidemic proportions. That's 2 out of 3. And more are dying every day, yet you want to relax." "I know," Kramer said. "But what can we do about it?" "We're working, but we're getting no results." "You might use that brain of yours," Mary said bitterly. "You're supposed to be a scientist. You have facts. Can't you put them together?" "I don't know," he shrugged. "I've been working on this problem longer than you think. I come down here at night." "I know. I clean up after you." "I haven't gotten anywhere. Sure, we can isolate the virus. It grows nicely on monkey lung cells. But that doesn't help. The thing has no apparent antigenicity. It parasitizes, but it doesn't trigger any immune reaction. We can kill it, but the strength of the germicide is too great for living tissue to tolerate." "Some people seem to be immune." "Sure they do. But why?" "Don't ask me. I'm not the scientist." "Play like one," Kramer growled. "Here are the facts. The disease attacks people of all races and ages. So far, everyone who is attacked dies. Adult Europeans and Americans appear to be somewhat more resistant than others on a population basis. Somewhere around 60% of them are still alive, but it's wiped out better than 80% of some groups. Children get it worse. Right now, I doubt if 1% of the children being born during the past 10 years are still alive." "It's awful," Mary said. "It's worse than that. It's extinction. Without kids, the race will die out." Kramer rubbed his forehead. "Have you any ideas?" "Children have less resistance," Kramer replied. "An adult gets exposed to a number of diseases to which he builds an immunity. Possibly one of these has a cross-immunity against Thurston's virus." "Then why don't you work on that line?" Mary asked. "Just what do you think I've been doing? That idea was put out months ago, and everyone has been taking a crack at it. There are 24 laboratories working full-time on that facet, and God knows how many more working part-time like we are. I've screened a dozen common diseases, including the 6 varieties of the common cold virus. All, incidentally, were negative." "Well, are you going to keep on with it?" "I have to." Kramer rubbed his eyes. "It won't let me sleep. I'm sure we're on the right track. Something an adult gets gives him resistance or immunity." He shrugged. "Tell you what, you run those bloods out and I'll go take another look at the data." He reached into his lab coat and produced a pipe. "I'll give it another try." "Sometimes I wish you'd read without puffing on that thing," Mary said. "Your delicate nose will be the death of me yet," Kramer said. "It's my lungs I'm worried about," Mary said. "They'll probably look like 2 pieces of well-tanned leather if I associate with you for another year." "Stop complaining. You've gotten me to wear clean lab coats. Be satisfied with a limited victory," Kramer said absently, his eyes staring unseeingly at a row of reagent bottles on the bench. Abruptly, he nodded. "Fantastic," he muttered, "but it's worth a check." He left the room, slamming the door behind him in his hurry. "That man," Mary murmured. "He'd drive a saint out of his mind. If I wasn't so fond of him, I'd quit. If anyone told me I'd fall in love with a pathologist, I'd have said they were crazy." I wish... Whatever the wish was, it wasn't uttered. Mary gasped and coughed rackingly. Carefully, she moved back from the bench, opened a drawer, and found a thermometer. She put it in her mouth. Then she drew a drop of blood from her forefinger and filled a red and white cell pipette and made a smear of the remainder. She was interrupted by another spasm of coughing, but she waited until the paroxysm passed and went methodically back to her self-appointed task. She had done this many times before. It was routine procedure to check on anything that might be Thurston's disease. A cold, a sore throat, a slight difficulty in breathing, all demanded the diagnostic check. It was as much a habit as breathing. This was probably the result of that cold she'd gotten last week, but there was nothing like being sure. Now, let's see. Temperature 99.5 degrees. Red cell count 4.5 million. White cell count, 2,500. Leukopenia. The differential showed a virtual absence of polymorphs, lymphocytes and monocytes. The whole slide didn't have 200. Eosinophils and basophils way up, 20 and 15% respectively. A relative rise rather than an absolute one. Leukopenia, no doubt about it. She shrugged. There wasn't much question. She had Thurston's disease. It was the beginning stages, the harsh cough, the slight temperature, the leukopenia. Pretty soon her white cell count would begin to rise, but it would rise too late. In fact, it was already too late. It's funny, she thought. I'm going to die, but it doesn't frighten me. In fact, the only thing that bothers me is that poor Walter is going to have a terrible time finding things. But I can't put this place the way it was. I couldn't hope to. She shook her head, slid gingerly off the lab stool, and went to the hall door. She'd better check in at the clinic, she thought. There was bed space in the hospital now. Plenty of it. That hadn't been true a few months ago, but the only ones who were dying now were the newborn and an occasional adult like herself. The epidemic had died out not because of lack of virulence, but because of lack of victims. The city outside, one of the first affected, now had less than 40% of its people left alive. It was a hollow shell of its former self. People walked its streets and went through the motions of life, but they were not really alive. The vital criteria were as necessary for a race as for an individual. Growth, reproduction, irritability, metabolism. Mary smiled wryly. Whoever had authored that hackneyed mnemonic that life was a grim proposition never knew how right he was, particularly when one of the criteria was missing. The race couldn't reproduce. That was the true horror of Thurston's disease. Not how it killed, but who it killed. No children played in the parks and playgrounds. The schools were empty. No babies were pushed in carriages or taken on tours through the supermarkets in shopping carts. No advertisements of motherhood or children's things were in the newspapers or magazines. They were forbidden subjects, too dangerously emotional to touch. Laughter and shrill young voices had vanished from the earth to be replaced by the drab greyness of silence and waiting. Death had laid cold hands upon the hearts of mankind, and the survivors were frozen to numbness. It was odd, she thought, how wrong the prophets were. When Thurston's disease broke into the news, there were frightened predictions of the end of civilization. But they had not materialized. There were no mass insurrections, no rioting, no organized violence. Individual excesses, yes, but nothing of a group nature. What little panic there was at the beginning disappeared once people realized that there was no place to go. And a grim passivity had settled upon the survivors. Civilization did not break down. It endured. The mechanics remained intact. People had to do something, even if it was only routine counterfeit of normal life, the stiff upper lip in the face of disaster. It would have been far more odd, Mary decided, if mankind had given way to panic. Humanity had survived other plagues nearly as terrible as this, and racial memory as long. The same grim patience of the past was here in the present. Man would somehow survive, and civilization go on. It was inconceivable that mankind would become extinct. The whole vast resources and pooled intelligence of surviving humanity were focused upon Thurston's disease. And the disease would yield. Humanity waited with childlike confidence for the miracle that would save it. And the miracle would happen. Mary knew it with a calm certainty as she stood in the cross corridor at the end of the hall, looking down the 30 yards of tile that separated her from the elevator that would carry her up to the clinic and oblivion. It might be too late for her, but not for the race. Nature had tried unaided to destroy man before, and had failed. And her unholy alliance with man's genius would also fail. She wondered, as she walked down the corridor, if the others who had sickened and died felt as she did. She speculated with grim amusement whether Walter Kramer would be as impersonal as he was with the others when he performed the post-mortem on her body. She shivered at the thought of that bare, sterile room and the shining table. Death was not a pretty thing. But she could meet it with resignation, if not with courage. She had already seen too much for it to have any meaning. She did not falter as she placed a finger on the elevator button. Poor Walter, she sighed. Sometimes it was harder to be among the living. It was good that she didn't let him know how she felt. She had sensed a change in him recently. His friendly impersonality had become merely friendly. It could, with a little encouragement, have developed into something else. But it wouldn't now. She sighed again. His hardness had been a tower of strength, and his bitter gallows humour had furnished a wry relief to grim reality. It had been nice to work with him. She wondered if he would miss her. Her lips curled in a faint smile. He would, if only for the trouble he would have in making chaos out of the order she had created. Why couldn't that elevator hurry? "Mary, where are you going?" Kramer's voice was in her ears, and his hand was on her shoulder. "Don't touch me." "Why not?" His voice was curiously different, younger, excited. "I have Thurston's disease," she said. He didn't let go. "Are you sure?" "The presumptive tests were positive." "Initial stages?" She nodded. "I had the first coughing attack a few minutes ago." He pulled her away from the elevator door that suddenly slid open. "You were going to that death trap upstairs," he said. "Where else can I go?" "With me," he said. "I think I can help you." "How? Have you found a cure for the virus?" "I think so. At least it's a better possibility than the things they're using up there." His voice was urgent. "And to think I might never have seen it if you hadn't put me on the track." "Are you sure you're right?" "Not absolutely, but the facts fit. The theory's good." "Then I'm going to the clinic. I can't risk infecting you. I'm a carrier now. I can kill you, and you're too important to die." "You don't know how wrong you are," Kramer said. "Let go of me." "No, you're coming back." She twisted in his grasp. "Let me go." She sobbed and broke into a fit of coughing worse than before. "What I was trying to say," Dr. Kramer said into the silence that followed, "is that if you have Thurston's disease, you've been a carrier for at least 2 weeks. If I am going to get it, your going away can't help. And if I'm not, I'm not." "Do you come willingly, or shall I knock you unconscious and drag you back?" Kramer asked. She looked at his face. It was grimmer than she had ever seen it before. Numbly, she let him lead her back to the laboratory. "But Walter, I can't. That's 60 in the past 10 hours, she protested. "Take it," he said grimly. "Then take another, and inhale, deeply." "But they make me dizzy." "Better dizzy than dead. And by the way, how's your chest?" "Better. There's no pain now, but the cough is worse." "It should be." "Why?" "You've never smoked enough to get a cigarette cough," he said. She shook her head dizzily. "You're so right," she said. "And that's what nearly killed you," he finished triumphantly. "Are you sure?" "I'm certain. Naturally, I can't prove it yet. But that's just a matter of time. Your response just about clinches it. Take a look at the records. Who gets this disease? Youngsters, with nearly 100% morbidity and 100% mortality. Adults, less than 50% morbidity and again 100% mortality. What makes the other 50% immune? Your crack about leather lungs started me thinking, so I fed the data cards into the computer and keyed them for smoking versus incidence. And I found that not one heavy smoker had died of Thurston's disease. Light smokers and non-smokers, plenty of them, but not one single nicotine addict. And there were over 10,000 randomized cards in that spot check. And there's the exact reverse of that classic experiment the lung cancer boys used to sell their case. Among certain religious groups which prohibit smoking, there was nearly 100% mortality of all ages. And so I thought since the disease was just starting in you, perhaps I could stop it if I loaded you with tobacco smoke. And it works. You're not certain yet, Mary said. I might not have had the disease. You had the symptoms, and there's virus in your sputum. Yes, but nothing. I've passed the word, and the boys in the other labs figure that there's merit in it. We're going to call it Barton's therapy, in your honor. It's going to cause a minor social revolution. A lot of laws are going to have to be rewritten. I can see where it's going to be illegal for children not to smoke. Funny, isn't it? I've contacted the maternity ward. They have 3 babies still alive upstairs. We get all the newborn in this town, or didn't you know? Funny, isn't it, how we still try to reproduce? They're rigging a smoke chamber for the kids. The head nurse is screaming like a wounded tiger, but she'll feel better with live babies to care for. The only bad thing I can see is that it may cut down on her chain smoking. She's been worried a lot about infant mortality. And speaking of nurseries, that reminds me. I wanted to ask you something. Yes? Will you marry me? I've wanted to ask you before, but I didn't dare. Now I think you owe me something, your life, and I'd like to take care of it from now on. Of course I will, Mary said. And I have reasons too. If I marry you, you can't possibly do that silly thing you plan. What thing? Naming the treatment Barton's. It'll have to be Kramer's. Teething Ring by James Causey. Narrated by William Skye. Anyone can make an error, but the higher the society, the more disastrous the mistake. Half an hour before, while she had been engrossed in the current soap opera and Harry Jr. was screaming in his crib, Melinda would naturally have slammed the front door in the little man's face. However, when the bell rang, she was wearing her new Chinese red housecoat, had just lustered her nails to a blinding scarlet, and Harry Jr. was sleeping like an angel. Yawning, Melinda answered the door, and the little man said, beaming, "Excellent day. I have Gigors for information." Melinda did not quite recoil. He was perhaps 5 feet tall, with a gleaming hairless scalp and a young old face. He wore a plain grey tunic, and a peddler's tray hung from his thin shoulders. "Don't want any," Melinda stated flatly. "Please." He had great beseeching amber eyes. "They all say that. I haven't much time. I must be back at the university by noon." "You working your way through college?" He brightened. "Yes, I suppose you could call it that. Alien anthropology major." Melinda softened. The initiations those frats pulled nowadays. Shaving the poor guy's head, eating goldfish. It was criminal. "Well," she asked grudgingly, "what's in the tray?" "Flanglers," said the little man eagerly. "Oscilloscopes, portable force field generators, a neural distorter." Melinda's face was blank. The little man frowned. "You use them, of course. This is a Class 4 culture." Melinda essayed a weak shrug, and the little man sighed with relief. His eyes fled past her to the blank screen of the TV set. "Ah, a monitor," he smiled. "For a moment I was afraid. May I come in?" Melinda shrugged, opened the door. This might be interesting, like a vacuum cleaner salesman who had cleaned her drapes last week for free. And Kitty Kyle Battle's life wouldn't be on for almost an hour. "My name is Porteous," said the little man with an eager smile. "I'm doing a thematic on Class 4 cultures." He whipped out a stylus, began jotting down notes. The TV set fascinated him. "It's turned off right now," Melinda said. Porteous's eyes widened impossibly. "You mean," he whispered in horror, "that you're exercising Class 5 privileges? This is terribly confusing. I get doors slammed in my face when Class 4s are supposed to have a splendid gregarian quotient. You do have atomic power, don't you?" "Oh, sure," said Melinda uncomfortably. This wasn't going to be much fun. "Space travel?" The little face was intent, sharp. "Well," Melinda yawned, looking at the blank screen. "They've got Space Patrol, Space Cadet, Tales of Tomorrow." "Excellent. Rocket ships or force fields?" Melinda blinked. "Does your husband own one?" Melinda shook her blonde head helplessly. "What are your economic circumstances?" Melinda took a deep, rasping breath, said, "Listen, mister, is this a demonstration or a quiz program?" "Oh, my excuse. Demonstration, certainly. You will not mind the questions?" "Questions?" There was an ominous glint in Melinda's blue eyes. "Your delightful primitive customs, art forms, personal habits." "Look," Melinda said, crimsoning, "this is a respectable neighbourhood, and I'm not answering any Kinsey report. Understand?" The little man nodded, scribbling. "Personal habits are taboo. I so regret. The demonstration." He waved grandly at the tray. "Anti-grav sandals? A portable solar converter? Apologizing for this miserable selection, but on Capella they told me—" He followed Melinda's entranced gaze, selected a tiny green vial. "This is merely a regenerative solution. You appear to have no cuts or bruises." "Oh," said Melinda nastily. "Cures warts, cancer, grows hair, I suppose." Porteous brightened. "Of course. I see you can scan. Amazing." He scribbled further with his stylus, glanced up, blinked at the obvious scorn on Melinda's face. "Here, try it." "You try it." Now watch him squirm. Porteous hesitated. "Would you like me to grow an extra finger, hair? Grow some hair." Melinda tried not to smile. The little man unstopped the vial, poured a shimmering green drop on his wrist, frowning. "Must concentrate," he said. "Thorium base, suspended solution. Really jolts the endocrines, complete control, see?" Melinda's jaw dropped. She stared at the tiny tuft of hair which had sprouted on that bare wrist. She was thinking abruptly, unhappily, about that chignon she had bought yesterday. They had let her buy that for $8, when with this stuff she could have a natural one. "How much?" she inquired cautiously. "A half-hour of your time only," said Porteous. Melinda grasped the vial firmly, settled down on the sofa with one leg tucked carefully under her. "Okay, shoot, but nothing personal." Porteous was delighted. He asked a multitude of questions, most of them pointless, some naive, and Melinda dug into her infinitesimal fund of knowledge and gave. The little man scribbled furiously, clucking like a gravid hen. "You mean," he asked in amazement, "that you live in these primitive huts of your own volition?" "It's a GI housing project," Melinda said, ashamed. "Astonishing." He wrote, "Feudal anachronisms and atomic power side by side. Class 4s periodically rough it in back-to-nature movements." Harry Jr. chose that moment to begin screaming for his lunch. Porteous sat trembling. "Is that a security alarm?" "My son," said Melinda despondently, and went into the nursery. Porteous followed and watched the ululating child with some trepidation. "Newborn?" 18 months, said Melinda stiffly, changing diapers. "He's cutting teeth." Porteous shuddered. What a pity. Obviously atavistic. Wouldn't the creche accept him? You shouldn't have to keep him here. I keep after Harry to get a maid, but he says we can't afford one. Manifestly insecure, muttered the little man, studying Harry Jr. Definite paranoid tendencies. He was 2 weeks premature, volunteered Melinda. He's real sensitive. I know just the thing, Porteous said happily. Here. He dipped into the glittering litter on the tray and handed Harry Jr. a translucent prism. A neural distorter. We use it to train regressives on Regal 2. It might be of assistance. Melinda eyed the thing doubtfully. Harry Jr. was peering into the shifting crystal depths with a somewhat strained expression. Speeds up the neural flow, explained the little man proudly. Helps tap the unused 80%. The pre-symptomatic memory is unaffected due to automatic cerebral lapse in case of overload. I'm afraid it won't do much more than cube his present IQ, and an intelligent idiot is still an idiot, but... How dare you? Melinda's eyes flashed. My son is not an idiot. You get out of here this minute and take your things with you. As she reached for the prism, Harry Jr. squalled. Melinda relented. Here, she said angrily, fumbling with her purse. How much are they? Medium of exchange? Porteous rubbed his bald skull. Oh, I really shouldn't, but it will make such a wonderful addendum to the chapter on malignant primitives. What is your smallest denomination? Is $1 okay? Melinda was hopeful. Porteous was pleased with the picture of George Washington. He turned the bill over and over in his fingers, at last bowed low and formally, apologized for any taboo violations, and left via the front door. Crazy fraternities, muttered Melinda, turning on the TV set. Kitty Kyle was dull that morning. At length Melinda used some of the liquid in the green vial on her eyelashes, was quite pleased at the results, and hid the rest in the medicine cabinet. Harry Jr. was a model of docility the rest of that day. While Melinda watched TV and munched chocolates, did and redid her hair, Harry Jr. played quietly with the crystal prism. Toward late afternoon he crawled over to the bookcase, wrestled down the encyclopedia and pored through it, gurgling with delight. He definitely, Melinda decided, would make a fine lawyer some day, not a useless putterer like Big Harry, who worked all hours overtime in that damned lab. She scowled as Harry Jr., bored with the encyclopedia, began reaching for one of Big Harry's tomes on nuclear physics. One putterer in the family was enough. But when she tried to take the book away from him, Harry Jr. howled so violently that she let well enough alone. At 6:30, Big Harry called from the lab with the usual despondent message that he would not be home for supper. Melinda said a few resigned things about cheerless dinners eaten alone, hinted darkly what lonesome wives sometimes did for company, and Harry said he was very sorry, but this might be it, and Melinda hung up on him in a temper. Precisely 15 minutes later, the doorbell rang. Melinda opened the front door and gaped. This little man could have been Porteous's double, except for the black metallic tunic, the glacial grey eyes. Mrs. Melinda Adams? Even the voice was frigid. Yes, why? Major Nord, Galactic Security. The little man bowed. You were visited early this morning by one Porteous. He spoke the name with a certain disgust. He left a neural distorter here, correct? Melinda's nod was tremulous. Major Nord came quietly into the living room, shut the door behind him. My apologies, madam, for the intrusion. Porteous mistook your world for a Class 4 culture instead of a Class 7. Here, he handed her the crumpled dollar bill. You may check the serial number. The distorter, please. Melinda shrunk limply onto the sofa. I don't understand, she said painfully. Was he a thief? He was careless about his spatial coordinates. Major Nord's teeth showed in the faintest of smiles. He has been corrected. Where is it? Now look, said Melinda with some asperity. That thing's kept Harry Jr. quiet all day. I bought it in good faith, and it's not my fault. Say, have you got a warrant? Madam, said the Major with dignity, I dislike violating local taboos, but must I explain the impact of a neural distorter on a backwater culture? What if your Neanderthal had been given atomic blasters? Where would you have been today? Swinging through trees, no doubt. What if your Hitler had force fields? He exhaled. Where is your son? In the nursery, Harry Jr. was contentedly playing with his blocks. The prism lay glinting in the corner. Major Nord picked it up carefully, scrutinized Harry Jr. His voice was very soft. You said he was playing with it? Some vestigial maternal instinct prompted Melinda to shake her head vigorously. The little man stared hard at Harry Jr., who began whimpering. Trembling, Melinda scooped up Harry Jr. Is that all you have to do? Run around frightening women and children? Take your old distorter and get out. Leave decent people alone. Major Nord frowned. If only he could be sure. He peered stonily at Harry Jr., murmured, Definite egomania. It doesn't seem to have affected him. Strange. Do you want me to scream? Melinda demanded. Major Nord sighed. He bowed to Melinda, went out, closed the door, touched a tiny stud on his tunic, and vanished. The manners of some people, Melinda said to Harry Jr. She was relieved that the Major had not asked for the green vial. Harry Jr. also looked relieved, although for quite a different reason. Big Harry arrived home a little after 11. There were small worry creases about his mouth and forehead, and the leaden cast of defeat in his eyes. He went into the bedroom, and Melinda sleepily told him about the little man working his way through college by peddling silly goods, and about that rude cop named Nord, and Harry said that was simply astonishing, and Melinda said, Harry, you had a drink? I had 2 drinks, Harry told her owlishly. You married a failure, dear. Part of the experimental model vaporized. Whoosh, just like that. On paper it looked so good. Melinda had heard it all before. She asked him to see if Harry Jr. was covered, and Big Harry went unsteadily into the nursery, sat down by his son's crib. Poor little guy, he mused. Your old man's a bum, a useless tinker. He thought he could send man to the stars on a string of helium nuclei. Oh, he was smart. Thought of everything. Auxiliary jets to kick off the negative charge, bigger mercury vapor banks, a fine straight thrust of positive alpha particles. He hiccuped, put his face in his hands. Didn't you ever stop to think that a few air molecules could defocus the stream? Try a vacuum, stupid. Big Harry stood up. Did you say something, son? Garfel? Said Harry Jr. Big Harry reeled into the living room like a somnambulist. He got pencil and paper, began jotting frantic formulae. Presently he called a cab and raced back to the laboratory. Melinda was dreaming about little bald men with diamond-studded trays. They were chasing her. They kept pelting her with rubies and emeralds. All they wanted was to ask questions, but she kept running, Harry Jr. clasped tightly in her arms. Now they were ringing alarm bells. The bells kept ringing, and she groaned, sat up in bed, and seized the telephone. Darling, Big Harry's voice shook. I've got it! More auxiliary shielding plus a vacuum. We'll be rich! That's just fine, said Melinda crossly. You woke the baby. Harry Jr. was sobbing bitterly into his pillow. He was sick with disappointment. Even the most favourable extrapolation showed it would take him 19 years to become master of the world. An eternity. 19 years. Thanks for listening. Remember, if you haven't already, head over to Substack where I'm publishing the majority of my content with plenty of free stories as well as opportunities for supporting me as a creator in a sustainable way. That's storiesfromthesky.sff.substack.com, link in the description. Thanks, and see you there.